The Titanic is still revealing secrets more than a century after it vanished beneath the Atlantic. Scientists have learned a lot after mapping a digital 3D version of the ship. They discovered the real damage caused by the iceberg and have watched for years as the famous wreck has slowly started to disappear piece by piece. These are some of the newest Titanic discoveries finally uncovered by researchers. For well over 100 years, people have been trying to make sense of what happened to Titanic during its final hours. 2022, a mapping company named Magellan Limited joined up with Atlantic Productions to gather some answers. They sent submersibles down to the ocean floor and took more than 700,000 photos covering every inch of the ship. By combining all those pictures, they made a complete 3D digital model of the entire wreck site. The scan let researchers see the bow and stern sitting about 800 meters apart in crystal clear detail. It also completely changed what we know about the iceberg collision. Most people always assumed the iceberg just cut this massive line straight through the steel side of the ship, but computer models built from the scan showed something a little different. But more detail on that in a bit. Parks Stevenson, a Titanic analyst, pointed out, quote, "Titanic is the last surviving eyewitness to the disaster, and she still has stories to tell. Having a comprehensive view of the entirety of the wreck site is key to understanding what happened here." The scan brought up clear visual proof that matches original survivor stories. Investigators spotted a smashed porthole, showing water and ice blew directly into passenger cabins right after impact. Over at the stern, they found an open steam valve. That open valve proves steam kept flowing to the electrical generators as the ship sank. The crew kept working down in the dark generator rooms to keep the electricity on as long as possible. As Park Stevenson continued, they kept the lights and the power working to the end to give the crew time to launch the lifeboats safely with some light instead of in absolute darkness, unquote. But this 3D scan has been incredibly important for researchers. Eventually, the wreck's gonna break down completely, but at least they have this digital backup now. As promised though, here's more detailed information on what the 3D scan revealed about the iceberg. So for almost a century, people thought they knew the exact story of how the Titanic went down. The ship bumped the iceberg sliced a 300-foot tear straight through the side of the hull. An image of a single massive slice became popular right after early investigations and stayed in books for decades. But when researchers examined the hull using the 3D scans, they found the steel didn't cut open in a long line at all. Instead, the collision created this series of small openings scattered across multiple sections of the ship. As the ship scraped against the iceberg, the force caused the steel plates to buckle and pop the iron rivets holding them together. That created small gaps and punctures along the seams, letting seawater leak in. Those small punctures allowed water to spill into 6 separate compartments. The Titanic was built with strong bulkheads. It could stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded, but because the damage stretched across 6, the weight of the water slowly pulled the bow down and sank the ship. The front railing of Titanic is easily one of the most recognizable spots on the entire ship, mostly because millions of people know it from the 1997 movie. But that classic view recently vanished. During a 2024 trip down to the wreck, researchers pointed their cameras at the front section of the ship and found a huge missing gap. A 15-foot section of the bow railing had completely snapped off and dropped down to the seafloor. Scans from older dives showed the metal weakening and leaning outward over the last few decades. The 2024 team used their deep-sea cameras to scan the mud directly under the bow and spotted the piece lying right in the sand. But this shows just how fast the ship's breaking down. When Robert Ballard first found Titanic in 1985, the hull looked surprisingly intact, but metal-eating bacteria and ocean currents are constantly chewing away at the steel frame. Inside Titanic's first-class lounge sat a bronze statue called the Diana of Versailles, which was a smaller copy of an ancient Roman sculpture showing the goddess of hunting. The ship broke apart and sank, the lounge collapsed, and the statue disappeared somewhere into the dark debris field. Explorers snapped a quick photo of the statue back during a 1986 dive, but underwater navigation back then wasn't accurate enough to mark the exact spot, so it ended up getting lost in the mud for nearly 40 years. Finding one specific bronze statue in a field scattered over 12,000 feet deep is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. In 2024, a team from RMS Titanic went with high-tech mapping gear. As their remote camera vehicle moved across the seafloor, the lights caught the statue sitting upright in the mud, remarkably well preserved. The team took high-resolution photos of the statue right where it lay. Nobody tried to raise it out of the water, though, scientists avoid disturbing the wreck site with heavy lift equipment because the metal's just too fragile. But finding Diana again helps historians reconstruct how the upper decks fell apart. Tracking where specific pieces landed gives experts a clearer picture of how the first-class lounge split open as the ship went down. When the Titanic sank in 1912, thousands of tons of steel dropped straight down to the dark ocean floor. Fast forward over a century, and that giant chunk of metal has turned into an artificial reef, home to an entire ecosystem. In 1985, explorers found the rusty ship sitting alone in the dark, but newer camera footage reveals that thousands of sea creatures have moved in. The whole wreck is covered in colonies of bacteria, sponges, sea worms, and other tiny organisms. That part of the Atlantic seafloor is mostly flat, soft mud where creatures don't have much to hold on to. The wreck, the Titanic, gave them a massive hard steel surface right in the middle of what is basically an underwater desert. Marine scientists have been studying these organisms to see how human structures break down in deep water. They discovered that specific ocean bacteria actually feed directly onto the iron side of the steel hull. As they digest the metal, they leave behind these long, drippy rust formations that hang off the ship. Comparing old dive footage to new video, it's pretty clear that nature is slowly taking over the wreck. More on those little icicle things, though. When search teams first reached the Titanic, they noticed strange orange formations hanging off the steel decks and railings. They looked like these reddish icicles made of rust. So scientists started calling them rusticles. They aren't just simple rust patches caused by salt water. Lab tests showed rusticles are actually living colonies made of millions of these iron-eating bacteria working together. These tiny microbes feed directly on the steel structure of the ship, and as they eat through the metal, they spit out rusty mineral waste that hardens into these hollow tubes. These tubes are fragile, though. They will crumble into dust if anything touches them. Researchers discovered these bacteria are specifically adapted for the deep ocean. They survive over 3,800 meters below the surface, freezing water, total darkness, and crushing pressure. Scientists even named one specific species Halomonas titanica after the ship, because these bacteria feed on the hull continuously. They're slowly destroying Titanic from the inside out. Scientists estimate the wreck loses tons of steel every year. Within the next few decades, major parts of the ship are going to collapse completely into a pile of rust. When explorers first found Titanic in 1985, they saw the bow and stern sitting in the sand. They knew pieces of debris were scattered nearby, but nobody realized how huge that field was until scientists mapped it out with modern sonar. Recent high-resolution mapping projects prove debris field stretches across about 15 square miles of seafloor. Thousands of items are scattered across the sand, far away from the two main pieces of the ship. Using sonar and remote submersibles, researchers have mapped out areas that were impossible to reach before. During recent trips, teams spotted hundreds of objects that had never been documented before, including structural plates, machinery, most hauntingly, all the personal stuff, suitcases, shoes, kitchen dishes lying in the mud miles away from the main wreckage. Exact layout of these items helped scientists reconstruct how Titanic fell apart on its way down. Heavy pieces like boilers dropped straight to the bottom. Lighter items drifted with the ocean currents as they sank, spreading out across the seafloor. For decades, historians debated how Titanic broke apart as it sank. Some survivors said the ship snapped in two at the surface. Others said it sank in one piece. Finding the bow and stern sitting miles apart in 1985 proved it broke up, but researchers wondered if other large sections tore away during the descent. Well, in 2010, an expedition using high-powered sonar mapped the whole debris field and found a massive section of hull lying completely by itself in the mud. Scientists nicknamed it the Big Piece. This section measures about 24 feet by 12 feet and weighs over 15 tons. It was originally part of the outer steel hull near the area where the ship snapped in two. The piece broke off near the surface and drifted down to the seafloor on its own. Finding the big piece gave researchers a look at Titanic's original construction. Since it landed away from the main wreck, it wasn't buried under piles of debris and it wasn't covered in the heavy rusticle growth, so scientists could examine the steel plating, the rivet lines, all the construction methods up close. When researchers recovered a corroded safe from the Titanic's debris field, they were hoping for cash or jewelry, but once the safe was finally opened, what they found wasn't treasure, it was wet, half-melted paper and black sludge. Some of the documents were too far gone to recover, but there were whispers that among them were letters detailing business dealings, passenger information, private notes that could have had historical importance, but what did survive wasn't the valuable stuff. It was receipts, random letters, odd banking forms, some completely blank. The unsettling part here isn't what was found, it's what wasn't. Something about the safe's contents didn't match the passenger manifest. It's entirely possible that something important was removed for or during the sinking, or that the safe was never what it seemed to begin with. Even now, some wonder, why was this particular safe stored where it was? Why so heavily protected when there was basically nothing inside it? Did someone know it was going down that night and try to bury a secret in 13,000 feet of water? The safe didn't answer any questions. If anything, it just made people ask more. When scientists first studied the Titanic wreck, they were shocked to find that the steel used to construct the ship was a lot more brittle than expected. The ship's hull, which was thought to be incredibly strong, had been compromised by a sulfur impurity in the steel. This made the metal especially fragile in the freezing cold waters of the North Atlantic. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, the impact caused the steel to shatter, tearing open the ship's sides. It wasn't just the iceberg that took down the Titanic, the actual material the ship was built from caused it to rapidly sink. We're all very familiar with this now, but it turned out the ship wasn't as indestructible as everyone thought. The Titanic's designers and engineers thought the ship was practically unsinkable, but this flaw in its construction, which was only apparent once the wreck was discovered, suddenly painted a very different picture. Now, out of all the personal things pulled from the Titanic wreck, one of the most powerful is a letter written by a first-class passenger named Oscar Halverson, an American businessman from Minnesota returning from a trip to Europe with his wife, Mary Alice. He took some time on board to write to his mother, talking about how beautiful the ship was and what life was like on board. The letter was found on his body, pulled from the ocean after the ship went down. The letter should have been destroyed. It was soaked in salt water for days, if not longer. But it survived, mostly intact, because it had been tucked away in an oilskin wallet. The cold water helped preserve the ink. So now, over 100 years later, you could still read his words. A man who didn't make it, but his message did. There's something about that that just hits hard. This was a personal note, casual, honest, and it makes everything that happened feel more real. That history isn't just a collection of stories from a long time ago, but that there were real people with real lives involved. People just like you and me.
Number 6. Wrong turn. It's the middle of the night, there aren't any binoculars at disposal, it's high tides, it's hard to see, but did the steersman accidentally point the Titanic towards the iceberg? Well, back in 2010, Louise Patton said this story was passed down from her grandfather, who just happened to be the most senior ship officer that survived that disaster. Apparently what happened was the iceberg was seen, and of course there was little time given the speed of the ship at that point, so command immediately issued to turn hard a starboard. That command was passed down a line like broken telephone. It was screamed past multiple people, so eventually the command was received as, make the ship turn right, rather than push the tiller to the right, which would have made the ship go left. It's confusing, and also at that moment, it's hard to hear. There's no chance this is anyone's fault. Number 5, not enough lifeboats. Before the Titanic set sail, at some point, a decision was made to reduce the number of lifeboats on board. They did this because they didn't want to clutter the deck, and looking back now, it's honestly haunting to think that was once a thought, like that mattered at all. It just ruined the aesthetic, like, okay, sure. The safety of 2,208 passengers aboard, we could use some more boats. The number of lifeboats ended up being reduced to just 20, with an additional 4 that were collapsible. 24 lifeboats, that's it. This meant that should they even have time to launch every single boat, this would only still be enough for half the passengers on board. Only half. And that's if it worked perfectly at that point. Even when the Titanic was going down, none of the lifeboats were able to be launched as everything unfolded quickly. Number 4, staying warm. The Titanic was obviously quite fancy. Its dining selections were fancy, the wines were fancy, it was all fancy, but alcohol was sadly reserved only for first class. The bar had 1,500 bottles of wine and 20,000 bottles of beer. Most of the people who passed away that night, it was because of icy temperatures in the water. I mentioned the alcohol in the cold water because one passenger named Charles Jogan, Charles was the baker on the ship, and when he realized the fate of the ship, it was probably going down, he drank everything he could see. He just chugged as much as he can. Honestly, I'm on board with drinking responsibly and all that, but if this was the case, yeah, of course, go for it. You don't want to be sober when this is happening. Charles was found 2 hours after the ship had completely gone down, somehow still treading water, and also somehow alive, and also extremely drunk. What happened here was the alcohol, the rather large amount of alcohol, slowed his heat loss, so he was able to hold on until help arrived, luckily. Number 3, a helping hand. John Astor was one of the first-class passengers on the ship that night. Now, as the ship was sinking, he put his wife on one of the lifeboats, but as he was about to get in himself with her, he saw 2 children standing behind him. Of course, they were petrified. So John Astor, he gave up his spot and let those 2 children take his instead. One of the Titanic survivors, named Philip Mock, later saw John and his valet huddled together on one of the life rafts trying to keep each other warm, but they both sadly didn't make it. A sad story, of course, but John's wife and the child that she was carrying at the time both survived and made it to safety. Number 2, an alternate trip. Not much was found of the Titanic afterwards. The pressure of the ocean, all those many secrets are truly lost to history. But there was an inspection card found. It belonged to a woman named Marion Meanwell. Now, this may seem like a mundane find at first, but it revealed a grim story for the woman. Once the card was found, it was revealed that Marion was not intended to be on the Titanic that night, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of those passengers. The card shows that originally she was supposed to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic, but due to a coal strike, the Majestic voyage was delayed, and she instead was then assigned to the Titanic. On Marion's card, you can see Majestic crossed out, and the new trip says Titanic. It's grim, it's very heartbreaking. And finally, number 1, ignored flares. Barely 20 miles away from where the Titanic sunk, there was another boat. This one was called the SS Californian. This boat had stopped in order to avoid the ice. The crew on the Titanic had also received warnings about the icebergs. The Titanic had actually received about 6 warnings before the collision. Only the first few were received by the captain. Now, the captain of this other boat slowed down and actually saw the emergency flares being set off on the Titanic ahead, but he ignored them because he thought they were company rockets. And the SOS signals that the Titanic sent out as well weren't received until the next day because the radio operator on that SS Californian had gone to sleep. By the time they heard these calls and arrived the next day, it was of course too late.
The Titanic and cursed Egyptian artifacts, 2 things you probably wouldn't think go together, but for decades there's been this eerie rumor about an ancient Egyptian artifact that was on board the Titanic when it sank. Sometimes called the unlucky mummy, it was actually a sarcophagus lid belonging to a priestess of Amun-Ra. Now, officially, the British Museum denies the artifact was ever on the ship, but some of these stories about this mummy actually came from Titanic survivors themselves. The story goes that the sarcophagus lid had caused problems even before the ship set sail. People who came in contact with it were said to have suffered accidents or even died unexpectedly. A wealthy collector, desperate to get rid of the thing, allegedly arranged to have it shipped to America on the Titanic. Even some early researchers and journalists claimed to have seen documentation putting the artifact on the ship's manifest, but that paperwork has mysteriously vanished over time. The wreckage has never turned up a confirmed piece of the lid, but considering how much of the debris field is still untouched, it's not out of the question completely. Wallace Hartley was the band leader on the Titanic, the man who stood on the deck playing music as the ship went down. He and his fellow musicians tried to calm passengers in the chaos by playing music until the end. Hartley didn't survive, but days later his body was found floating in the Atlantic with his violin case still strapped to him. That violin became one of the most haunting relics connected to the disaster. For decades, people weren't even sure it still existed, but in 2006 it suddenly turned up in an attic in England. Tests showed the wood had saltwater damage, and an inscription on the tailpiece confirmed it was a gift from Hartley's fiancée. Scientists even used forensic analysis and CT scans to prove that it wasn't a fake. Today, the violin's been auctioned off for nearly $1 million, but should it have stayed lost? Some believe that items like this, so tied to tragedy, can carry an energy that may not be good to bring into your home. Adolf Saalfeld was a first-class passenger on the Titanic and a perfume maker. When the ship went down, so did his luggage, including a small black bag carrying dozens of tiny glass perfume vials. They were meant for business meetings in America, where he hoped to sell his latest fragrance blends. The bag was recovered decades later, buried in the mud 2.5 miles beneath the ocean. And you'd think those delicate bottles would have been destroyed, but not only were they intact, the scents were still there. And I just find that kinda eerie. It's easy to forget that the Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was carrying people from all walks of life, all with hopes and dreams. And artifacts like this bring all of that crashing back. Something about that lingering scent, still alive after all these years. It hits harder than some photos or wreckage can. Some conservators and researchers feel uneasy around it too, that there's something off about standing in a room and suddenly smelling something that came from one of the most infamous tragedies in modern history, and I gotta say, I'd have to agree with them. Among the debris pulled from the Titanic's wreck site was something small, almost easy to miss. A child's toy marble. Just a little glass sphere about the size of a thumbnail. When it was found in a leather pouch alongside other personal items, it stopped the recovery team cold. This thing had most likely belonged to a youngster. That just hits different. Scientists believe it may have belonged to a young boy traveling third class, one of the many immigrant families hoping for a new start in America. The marble was slightly worn from use. Maybe it was carried as a comfort object, and the fact that it went down with the ship, then sat undisturbed for nearly a century at the bottom of the Atlantic, man, that is somber. There's a weight that comes with holding something that personal. When recovery teams first found a pair of small shoes near the Titanic wreck, it was pretty creepy. These weren't just scraps of leather. They'd been worn by a child. They'd been sitting on the seafloor for nearly 100 years, and they were still recognizable. They're believed to belong to an unidentified person, possibly the youngest victim ever found, a boy who was pulled from the ocean by a recovery ship and buried in a grave simply marked unknown child. For decades, no one knew who he was, and these shoes became a symbol of every nameless person lost that night. Forensic science eventually identified the boy as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a boy from England who died along with his entire family. The shoes helped make that connection, but even with a name now, the image of those tiny shoes sitting alone in the mud is something people don't shake off easily. One of the most chilling items recovered from the Titanic wreck was a pocket watch that had stopped at 2:20 a.m., the exact time the ship struck the iceberg. I don't think I need to do much explaining here. That is incredibly unsettling. A grim reminder of the exact moment when everything went into total chaos. Who owned the watch? What were they thinking about right before the hands of that little clock hit 2:20? We'll never know. Another one of the eeriest things pulled from the Titanic's wreck is a life jacket that clearly did not do its job. This particular one came from the body recovery missions, not the wreck itself. After the Titanic went down, ships like the Mackay Bennett were sent out to find the dead. One of the crew, Robert Edwards, picked up this life jacket from a body floating in the Atlantic. It's made of cork and canvas, old school and heavy, still intact to this day. All the ties are still there. The cork is discolored from salt water, but it hasn't broken down. What's unsettling though is that the jacket survived, but whoever was wearing it obviously didn't. Cork floats, but it doesn't save you from freezing water. It doesn't save you from hypothermia. This jacket was supposed to be someone's last hope, and all it ended up doing was keeping their body afloat long enough to be recovered, dead or alive. Charles Jochen, the Titanic's chief baker, spent hours in the freezing water before finally being rescued, and would go on to say it was mostly thanks to the whiskey in his system. Born in Birkenhead, England in 1878, Jochen had a long maritime career before joining the crew of the Titanic. On the night of April 14th of 1912, after the ship struck the iceberg, he organized his baking staff to deliver bread to the lifeboats. He was assigned to Lifeboat 10, but he chose not to board, instead helping others before returning to his quarters, where he pounded back a significant amount of booze. As the ship sank into the Atlantic, he reportedly rowed the stern down, entering the freezing water without submerging his head, and then he spent about 2 hours in the icy sea, and later said that he probably survived thanks to the whiskey, which he figured insulated him against the cold. After the disaster, he continued his maritime career and later settled in Paterson, New Jersey, where he passed away in 1956. Michel Marcel Navratil, born in Nice, France in 1908, was one of the last living survivors of the Titanic tragedy, becoming known as the Titanic Orphan. In a custody dispute, his father, Michel Navratil Sr., abducted him and his younger brother Edmund, taking them aboard the Titanic under the alias Louis M. Hoffman. Claiming to be a widower, he was intending to start a new life in America. On the night of the sinking, their father placed the boys in Collapsible D, the last lifeboat successfully launched. He sank with the ship. The brothers, unable to communicate their identities, were simply dubbed the Titanic orphans in the press. Their photographs circulated though, and eventually reached their mother, Marcelle, who traveled to New York to reunite with them. Michel grew up to become a philosophy professor at the University of Montpellier. He passed away in 2001, remembered as one of the last male survivors of the Titanic. Molly Brown was born Margaret Tobin, but the unsinkable Molly Brown is how most people remember her. When she boarded the Titanic in 1912, she was already rich thanks to her husband striking gold in Colorado. But she didn't just spend money. She fought for workers' rights, women's rights, and education, and her drive to help others only continued when the Titanic began to sink. Molly didn't panic. She helped people get into their lifeboats and eventually ended up in Lifeboat 6 herself. Once in the water, she argued with the crew to turn back and look for more survivors. When they refused, well, she helped row the boat herself, even handing over her furs to others who were freezing. And she led a pretty interesting life after she was rescued, too. She helped raise money for survivors who had lost everything, and later ran for US Senate decades before women could even vote nationwide. Colonel Archibald Gracie IV was a wealthy historian from a long line of military men. When he boarded the Titanic, he was in first class, and he was kind of obsessed with the ship. He was writing a book about it even before it sank. But when the iceberg hit, Gracie went into action. He helped women and children get into lifeboats, stayed on board until the very end. When the ship broke in two, he jumped into the water and somehow made it to an overturned lifeboat. He clung to it all night in the freezing cold with dozens of other men trying not to die. Gracie survived, but it messed him up. He wrote one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the sinking, finishing it just before he died less than a year later. His health had started failing, but people close to him said it was more than that. He couldn't stop reliving what happened. He had nightmares, he couldn't sleep, and when he passed away in December of 1912, some said he was still calling out for help. His last words? "We must get them all in the boats." He made it off the Titanic, but part of him never really did. Frederick Fleet was one of the Titanic's lookouts, the guy who actually spotted the iceberg and rang the warning bell. He shouted those famous words, "Iceberg right ahead." He did his job, but it was too late. There weren't enough lifeboats, and the ship was going too fast. The crash was going to happen no matter what. Fleet managed to survive by getting into Lifeboat 6, the same one Molly Brown was in. But surviving the disaster didn't mean his life got easier. He went back to working jobs on ships, but he was never really okay again. He dealt with depression, and later on, life kept piling on more problems. He lost his wife in 1964, and after that, things just continued to spiral. He ended up living with relatives and struggling to find work. In 1965, just a year after his wife died, Fleet took his own life. He was 77 years old. What's even sadder is that he was buried in an unmarked grave. For decades, no one really wanted to talk about him. Not the man who warned the ship, not the guy whose voice was the first to sound the alarm. Eventually, a gravestone was added in his memory, but it took a long time for people to give him the respect that he deserved. Edith Eileen Brown was just 15 when she boarded the Titanic with her parents. They were traveling to America to start a new life. Her father had big dreams. He wanted to open a hotel in Cape Town and make a fresh start. But none of that happened. When the ship hit the iceberg, Edith and her mother were put in a lifeboat. Her father stayed behind. She remembered the last thing he said to her, "I'll see you later." But, of course, she never did. He went down with the ship, and Edith and her mom had to figure out how to survive in a new country with nothing. They ended up in New York for a while, but eventually made their way back to South Africa. Edith didn't stay quiet about what happened. As she got older, she gave interviews and told her story to keep the memory of the Titanic alive, especially the people who didn't make it. She went on to have a family and live a full life, but she never forgot that night. You could hear it in her voice when she talked about it, even in her 90s. She lived a long life though, passing away in 1997 at the age of 100. For a long time, she was one of the last living Titanic survivors. In fact, she died just 1 month after Titanic hit theaters.
Let's at number 10, first class. While traveling in first class may feel more comfortable when it came to the sinking of the Titanic, first class passengers had a better chance at survival. Just over 200 first class passengers survived out of the 324 souls traveling in first class during that fateful voyage. If you've seen the James Cameron film, you know women and children were first to board these lifeboats, and then it was first class men. By that point, there were a few lifeboats left, which I'll get into later on, that's a whole thing. But second class and third class, their chances at survival were not great. Being stored further and lower away from these lifeboats, it took longer to get there, especially with the rush and the crowds too. It was chaos. There were more than 700 third-class passengers. That number exceeded the other two classes combined. And those rooms were horrible. They were crammed. 4 people would have to share one tiny room, and each of the beds were smaller than twin beds. So when it comes to evacuating quickly, sadly these passengers had the hardest time getting out. Number 9. Locked doors. Ellen Hakarian was aboard the Titanic April 15, 1912, and back in September 1987, Tanky magazine published her survival story. It was titled Going Down with the Titanic in Third Class. Ellen and her husband Pekko decided to leave Finland and start a new life in America. The night of April 14th, after the couple had returned to their cabin and got settled in, they heard a loud scraping sound and the engine started to act up a bit. Pekko left the room to go and see what was going on. The hallway was tilted by time Ellen poked her head out moments later once she heard a ruckus in the hallway. There was then a knock at the door. One of her friends from Finland came and they said the ship was sinking, but Pekko was nowhere to be seen at this point. He was still gone. Her friend asked, how did he get out of the passageway in the first place, because all the doors are now locked. I was confused. I didn't know what to do next, and after a few moments I grabbed my purse and life jacket and ran out to the passageway. The door was locked. All the doors were locked. A steward finally came along to guide the crew to the third deck, where they were taken to the Carpathia. They didn't arrive to a safe ship until the sun was up the next morning, and after losing her husband and all of her belongings, Aileen received $125. That's horrible. After that entire night, they're like, here's some money. That would be around $4,000 now, which is not enough to fix anything. Number 8, record time. It's been noted by many survivors that the Titanic was traveling quite fast, faster than anything they've experienced before. Well, that's because the ship's captain, Edward J. Smith, was trying to beat the crossing time of the Titanic's older White Star sibling. Now, there were already concerns about icebergs at this point, but the fact that the captain still went ahead at full speed, regardless of all the oncoming icebergs, well, sure didn't help. Astronomers at Texas State University at San Marcos discovered something cosmic that may have had something to do with the sinking of the Titanic that night. The alignment of the sun, the moon, and us on Earth could have created higher than normal tides in the Atlantic Ocean around January 1912. So by the time the Titanic was whipping through months later, icebergs that used to be stuck in the Labrador Sea could have gotten in the way. It also would have helped to see the iceberg approaching from afar. But number 7, no binoculars. On the night of the collision, binoculars were locked up the entire time. Of course, this could have possibly changed history, so why weren't they used? Where were they? Well, the key to the lockup was being held by Officer David Blair. Only before the Titanic's departure from Southampton, Officer Blair was pulled from the crew. Of course, this may not have made a difference at all, with all things considered, but it's important to note. To think these were stashed in a locker in the crow's nest this entire time is actually pretty haunting. Poor guy was transferred to another ship and forgot to give the key back. The amount of times I've taken a work key home with me, honestly, it's a simple mistake, so this is tragic.
Eva Hart was just 7 years old when she boarded the Titanic with her parents. They were moving to Canada to start fresh, but her mother had a bad feeling about the trip from the start. She didn't trust the ship, called it too big, too fast, and too proud. She refused to sleep at night while they were on board, and that gut instinct may have saved their lives. When the iceberg hit, Eva's father put her and her mother into a lifeboat. He stayed behind. Like so many others, he didn't make it. Eva never saw him again. She said later that she remembered the screams in the dark and the horrible silence that followed. It stuck with her for the rest of her life, but Eva wasn't someone who let it break her. As she got older, she talked openly about the disaster and didn't hold back. She was especially critical of White Star Line and how unprepared the ship was. She hated how they tried to avoid responsibility and kind of downplayed the tragedy soon afterwards. Eva lived a long life and never stopped speaking out. She kept a photo of her father by her bed until the day she died. And even decades after the incident, she refused to forgive the people in charge. She said you can't call something an act of God when it was caused by human arrogance. She made sure her voice and her father's memory were never forgotten. Harold Bride was one of the Titanic's 2 wireless operators, the guys who sent and received messages for the ship. When the iceberg hit, he and his coworker Jack Phillips stayed at their post, sending out SOS calls while chaos just broke out around them. They were some of the last people left working while everyone else was trying to get off the ship. Water started flooding the room while they were still transmitting. Jack kept working until the power cut out. Harold tried to escape and was swept off the ship by a wave. He managed to find an overturned lifeboat, Collapsible B, and climbed on. Dozens of men were clinging to it all night, trying to survive in freezing water. Harold was rescued, but he didn't walk away without scars. His feet were badly frostbitten, and he had to be carried from the Carpathia after being pulled from the ocean. He lost his friend Jack, and the trauma never really left him. After the disaster, Bride testified at the Titanic inquiries and eventually went back to working for the Marconi Company, but he didn't like talking about what happened. He kept a low profile for the rest of his life and avoided the spotlight, passing away in 1956. Lawrence Beasley was a second-class passenger on the Titanic. He was a science teacher from London. When the iceberg struck, Beasley quietly made his way to the boat deck and managed to get into Lifeboat 13. But what really sets Beasley apart is what he did afterward. He wrote one of the very first survivor accounts of the disaster, a book called The Loss of the SS Titanic, which came out just 2 months later. And he approached the book like a scientist, calm, detailed, and brutally honest. He criticized the lack of lifeboats, the poor emergency response, and how preventable the whole thing was. His book helped shape how the public saw the disaster. And years later, Beasley also became known for a pretty strange stunt. He tried to sneak onto the set of the 1958 film A Night to Remember, the Titanic movie that came out years before the James Cameron film. So he snuck onto set while they were filming the scene where the ship sinks. His reason was he wanted to go down with the ship. The director stopped him, but it really showed how deeply the event stuck with him. He never fully let it go. Beasley died in 1967, but his account is still one of the most respected first-hand records of what really happened that night. And finally, we have Violet Jessup, a woman who narrowly avoided death 3 separate times, all on ships. Violet's story honestly sounds made up. Like some screenwriter was just like, hey, what if we had one lady survive 3 of the most major ship disasters of the early 1900s? She was on the RMS Olympic when it collided with a British warship in 1911, lived. She worked as a stewardess on the Titanic when it hit the iceberg in 1912. And amid all the chaos, someone told her to show the non-English speakers how to get in the lifeboats. She did it, got on Lifeboat 16, and lived to tell the tale. Now you'd think that 2 near-death ship experiences would be enough for anyone, but not her. In 1916, she was a nurse on the Britannic, which was basically Titanic's twin sister ship. That one hit a mine in the Aegean Sea and started sinking. Violet threw on a lifeboat, jumped into the water, got smacked in the head by a lifeboat propeller, and still survived. Pretty amazing life.
In our number 5 spot today, we have Bess Waldo Daniels. This story comes from someone who uses the online username Bessie A, and they wrote about how they firmly believe that their past life was intertwined with the tragic tale of the Titanic. Recounting their memories as Bess Waldo Daniels, the validation of their past existence as Bess stems from an intriguing discovery. Photographs of her husband and children bear an uncanny resemblance to the images that once flashed through their mind. They have distinct memories from this life that go all the way back to childhood, memories of their sister, their parents, and even later memories as well, ones that include their past life husband, Hud. Curiously, their memories skip the moments of meeting and marrying Hudson. Instead, they recall the births of both their children, Helen and Hutsy. While their memories encompass the Titanic, they admit gaps concerning the journey from Canada to England and their activities in England. Their recollections resume within their stateroom, basking in the sunlight streaming through the porthole. On the night of the sinking, Hudson briefly disappears, but upon his return he leads everyone to the boat deck, cautioning against using the elevators and urging the stairs instead. Though their memories fail to bridge the gap between reaching the boat deck and the subsequent events, a serene atmosphere pervades their recollection. People converse calmly in groups, interrupted only by the arrival of a tall man with a brown beard whose words escape their memory but stir a feeling of discomfort within them. Turning their attention to Hudson, they observe a profound change in his demeanor, as if life itself drains from his being. Suddenly, they find themselves in a boat surrounded by fearful and anxious individuals. A scared-looking woman with distinct cheekbones sits next to them, while another refined lady, very English, occupies a nearby seat. Amid the chaotic scene, they cry out but cannot recall their exact words. Waiting at a nearby boat, two officers, identifiable by their uniforms and hats, accompany them, but suddenly, as if the ship vanishes beneath their feet, the man loses grip and they descend into the ocean depths. The original post explains that they had to cut out so many of the details that they can remember, and I also had to cut out details that they did include for the sake of this video, so it's very clear that this person has a ton of memories of this past life. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Grand Staircase. This post came from the Reddit user called Vish Trinity, and they titled their post, "I am sure I died in the Titanic." They continued on to write, "I was 6 when my mother told me about a ship named the Titanic that sank in 1912, and that's when I started getting dreams where I could see the vast deck, the ballroom, the famous Grand Staircase. I would also get dreams about floating in the ice-cold water, seeing the huge ship break in two, and a lot of things. This was a year before the movie came out. Also, let me tell you, my mother never told me how the ship sank or about the interiors of the ship, as in the ballroom, deck, etc. When the movie came out, it was like deja vu for me. All the scenes felt like I had been there and experienced it before. So I'm sure I was on the Titanic and died in the ice-cold water on that fateful night in a past incarnation." In our number 3 spot today, we have the Titanic memory. This story comes from Reddit user Commodore Comac, and they wrote in the past lives thread, and they said, quote, "I appreciate the fact that there are many more people who claim to have been on the Titanic in a past life than could have possibly been on the ship, but when I was 11 years old, I had the clearest dream that I have ever had, and that includes the subsequent 3 decades of my life. I'm standing on the deck of the ship, I'm in a heavy fur coat, and my gloved hands are holding on to a wooden rail. Overhead is a night sky filled with stars, but no moon. 4 funnels stretch above me. There is the sizzle of white rockets racing towards the stars. The ship is sinking by the bow. There is darkness and water. I die. A year later, I read the book A Night to Remember. Then I learned about the sinking of the Titanic, a ship with 4 funnels. Sank by the bow on a clear night. Fired distress rockets. Not enough lifeboats. Logical explanation? Easy. Overheard a story. Saw something on the television. Happened to have a dream about a ship and just happened to get some facts right. But it didn't feel like a dream then, and it still doesn't." In our number 2 spot today, we have Mark Robert Hopkins. This person posted online with their story, and they wrote, quote, "They're not as much memories as familiar sensations, really. The distant sound of violin music playing, the feeling of plush carpet beneath me, the flickering of wall sconces, the cramped feeling of slowly working my way up a stairwell with many others, a slanting deck, a vast black wall of metal rising up along one side, the biting cold air, the sound of metal grinding and booming sounds popping in the darkness, the feeling of aloneness and desperation of being isolated in a lifeboat in a vast body of water at night miles from anywhere. It all seems so familiar, and this was even before I began learning about the Titanic. As a matter of fact, the curiosity behind it drew me into the Titanic. As for who, definitely not someone important. Somehow the identity of a 10, 12, or 14-year-old boy stands out to me, first or second class with the last name O something, as in O'Brien for example, although I don't remember there having been any O'Briens in first or second class. The sensations are vivid, not cohesive. It's like they're latent or submerged in trying to put themselves together and come to the surface, like pieces of very old memories. Others I know are supportive of this and agree with the possibility that I just may have been on the Titanic. Finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have Robert Ballard. Renowned oceanographer Robert Ballard carved a unique place for himself in history when he discovered the wreckage of the ill-fated RMS Titanic in 1985. But the intriguing aspect of Ballard's connection to the Titanic extends beyond his historical discovery. Throughout his life, Ballard was fueled by a deep, inexplicable connection to the Titanic, an uncanny bond that was pivotal in his relentless pursuit of the ship's final resting place. Some paranormal researchers have contemplated on the nature of this very extraordinary connection. They posit that Ballard may have had a past life association with the Titanic, suggesting that his intense drive to find the ship was more than a mere professional ambition or a personal obsession. Could it be that he was subconsciously attempting to unravel the threads of his own past? A past that was tragically intertwined with the Titanic's ill-fated voyage?
We have the theory that the Titanic didn't actually sink, but instead its sister ship, the Olympic, did. You see, both the Titanic and the Olympic were owned by the same company, which was owned by JP Morgan. The theory goes that JP Morgan had wanted to sink one of the ships for the insurance money. Of course, being newer, the Titanic would rake in a lot more than the outdated Olympic, who had already been in a previous accident. But JP Morgan didn't want to sink his brand new boat he had just had other people spend so much time building. And so he did what any twisted businessman would do. He switched the two out. He sent the Olympic, which was unfit for the voyage, out to sea disguised as the Titanic. This claim has actually been backed by photographs of the wreck, in which the outline of the windows matches those of the Olympic, not the Titanic. Not only that, but just before the Titanic was scheduled to set sail, JP Morgan, along with many of his close friends and trusted colleagues, all of a sudden decided not to go. But if that doesn't do it for you, maybe this will. James Fenton, who allegedly worked on the Titanic, confessed to the switch on his deathbed. He said that he would have come clean sooner, but he feared for his life if he told the truth. I guess that didn't matter anymore.
There's also a theory that a steering mistake led to the disaster and that it was all covered up. Louise Patton, granddaughter of Second Officer Charles Lightroller, revealed a family secret in 2010. She said that a steering mistake may have played a role in the Titanic's sinking. Now, according to her, when the iceberg was spotted, First Officer William Murdoch instructed Quartermaster Robert Hitchens to turn the ship hard to starboard. Apparently, Hitchens panicked though and turned the wheel the wrong way, causing a delay before the mistake was corrected. This delay could have cost crucial minutes in avoiding the iceberg. Charles Lightroller supposedly learned about the error during a final meeting between officers before the ship sank, and his granddaughter, Louise Patton, stated that Lightroller kept this information to himself during the inquiry because he was told that revealing this big mistake would bankrupt the company and cost everyone their jobs.
Okay, so I talked about how JP Morgan all of a sudden decided to opt out of hopping onto the Titanic's maiden voyage. Well, you know who didn't opt out? JP Morgan's business rivals Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim. That's a fun name. If you haven't already guessed where I'm going with this, I'm saying JP Morgan orchestrated the sinking of the Titanic in order to take out his business rivals. Or he sunk the Olympic to take out his business rivals and get a significant amount of insurance money on an old piece of junk all in one go. Apparently, prior to the Titanic leaving the docks of Southampton in England, JP Morgan had gotten into a dispute with the three men over a banking venture. Morgan had wanted to create a US Federal Reserve Bank. Jacob, Isidor, and Benjamin opposed. They died, and a year later, under JP Morgan's influence, the bank opened. Coincidence or cold-blooded killer?
Maybe the Titanic just wasn't as great a ship as it was made out to be. An unsinkable ship that sinks on its maiden voyage? It's pretty sad stuff. Sounds like there may have been some structural weaknesses involved. There were a few things that might have made it more vulnerable to sinking. One biggie was the way it was built. The Titanic was supposed to be super strong, but it had this design flaw where it wasn't divided up properly inside. Normally ships have watertight compartments to keep water from spreading if there is a leak, but the Titanic's compartments weren't sealed off all the way to the top, so when it hit the iceberg, water sloshed all over the top and flooded into areas that it shouldn't have. Another issue was the quality of the materials. Some folks say the steel used to build the Titanic wasn't as good as it could have been, it could break more easily, especially in super cold water like the North Atlantic. So when the iceberg hit, instead of bending or absorbing the impact, the steel just cracked, making the damage even worse. And then there's the whole deal with the rivets. The ones used on the Titanic might have been weaker than they should have been. When the ship hit the iceberg, it put a lot of stress on those rivets, and some of them might have popped out, making it easier for water to get in.
Another theory is that a coal fire in the furnace room caused the ship to accelerate to a speed which made collision with oncoming icebergs unavoidable. The theory goes that a pile of sorted coal begins slowly burning with no smoke or flame, but burning nonetheless on the floor of the furnace room, and so to avoid a fire breaking out aboard the ship, the coals were placed into the furnace. What at first seems like a great idea soon turned into disaster. As the extra coals burned, they caused excess steam to form, which in turn caused the ship's speed to increase uncontrollably as the vessel raced forward directly into an iceberg-infested body of water. This is one of the most respected theories, actually, behind the reason for the Titanic's demise, other than poor navigation, of course, as it has been supported by records that show that a fire had in fact broken out in the Titanic's forward bunker, which would have likely been caused by the excess of coals added to the furnace not long before the ship went down. Whether or not this was intentional, however, is still up for debate.
One of the eeriest items ever recovered from the Titanic wreck is the barnacle-crusted head of a porcelain doll. This doll belonged to Eva Hart, a young girl who survived the sinking but had to leave her doll behind in the rush to the lifeboats. Eva lived into the 90s and would often speak about the doll when telling her story, but what no one expected was that 65 years after the disaster, the doll's head would actually be found. It turned up in the 70s, 2,000 meters underwater, halfway between Southampton and New York, during a salvage operation led by Captain Abel Federico Nogueras. The head, which was cracked, bald, and covered in sea growth, was later confirmed to match a 1906 mold used by the original German manufacturer. Its body was never recovered, but today the head looks pretty grotesque. As you can see, lifeless eyes, the faded paint, the stains, there are barnacles all over it, which isn't pretty. Eva herself never saw it again before her death in 1996, but she was glad to know it had been found. Honestly, if she did see the doll head, she'd probably cry. Recovered in the early 2000s, this leather suitcase spent nearly a century at the bottom of the North Atlantic. Remarkably, the outer shell held together, keeping the contents inside mostly intact. Gloves, a pair of spectacles, a comb, and a small journal were found inside. Obviously, the journal drew immediate attention. Most of the ink had faded, but infrared imaging revealed some scattered entries, and one stood out. A short passage describing a dream about drowning in cold darkness. Not only is this creepy as is, but it was also dated just days before the Titanic actually sank. The identity of the writer was never confirmed, and the entry didn't mention any names. Now, could this have been a coincidence? Sure. I mean, I think, the possibility of drowning is probably on a lot of people's minds when they hop on a boat, but that doesn't make the journal entry any less somber or unsettling, and it stuck with the crew who recovered it, not just because of any supernatural stuff, but because it just felt unfinished, like someone's thoughts have been paused and then just left there waiting. I mean, that is kind of exactly what happened. The Titanic's grand staircase is one of its most iconic images, elegant, ornate. At the time, it represented everything the Titanic claimed to be, new, extravagant, advanced, but it did not survive. It was most likely crushed as the ship split apart and sank, but during expeditions in the 80s, divers found what they believed were fragments of it in the forward debris field. One piece in particular, a section of handrail, was buried in sediment and warped. The wood had cracked along the grain, it was waterlogged and stripped of its finish. There was really nothing grand about it now, just this splintered piece of railing, but that's what got some of the divers. This was something hundreds of people had leaned on, walked past, maybe even desperately held on to during their final moments. So seeing it sitting down there in the dark where it fell, it hit harder than anyone expected. One diver later said it felt like finding a piece of a memory. not just wood. Inside a steward's footlocker was a clump of belongings, mostly ruined by pressure and seawater, but among them a few sheets of music survived. One in particular caught everyone's eye. Of course, there was a lot of damage, but there was a title at the top, "Near My God to Thee." It's the hymn reported to have been played as the ship was going down. Whether that's true or just part of the lore, finding the actual sheet music changed the way people talked about the story. The ink had bled in places, leading some to call it the page that cried. Others noticed faint fingerprints along the edge, possibly from whoever packed it. Divers found a bunch of tools in the wreck's engineering section, surrounded by crumpled steel and collapsed walls. Just tools at first glance: coal shovels, wrenches, heavy-duty tongs. A few had warped or melted, some were fused to nearby piping. One wrench still had a torn piece of glove jammed into its handle. These weren't dropped, they were in use. Everything about how they were found pointed to people working during the disaster, not running. Some tools were mid-task, left exactly where they'd been used, holding on, doing their jobs as long as they could. There's nothing flashy about any of this. It's just iron and grime. I mean, most of it's unrecognizable. It's the kind of gear that you'd walk past in a museum without really thinking much about it, but to the divers and crew who pulled them up, these tools were almost more important than jewelry or silver. They belonged to the people who had the worst job on the ship, trapped below deck, still trying to keep the ship from going down. A small Bible was found inside a cloth bundle, tucked into a coat's inner pocket. Small, leather-bound, warped from water, but still mostly intact. The pages had swelled from the moisture, but one section was still readable. Psalm 69. A pencil underlined beneath one line: "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck." No one knows when it was marked. Could have been before the voyage, could have been during, could have been as the ship was going down. The pencil mark was faint, but it was definitely there. The cloth wrapping probably helped keep the Bible together. Most paper items that deep didn't stand a chance, of course. This one somehow did, and it wasn't ornate or expensive. The cover was plain, with no inscription, just something someone brought with them because it mattered to them. This came out of a small handbag recovered from the debris field, a compact mirror, cracked straight through the center, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in any woman's purse in 1912. Basic, silver-colored case, no engraving. It wasn't valuable, but something about the mirror caught attention right away. Before it was even brought up, a diver noticed how the broken glass reflected strangely in the submersible lights. The cracks made these shapes that almost looked like eyes. At least that's how they felt at the time. Another diver joked that it blinked. Now obviously it didn't. It was just fractured glass reacting to the light, but after that, people started calling it the mirror that blinked. Not seriously, just as a nickname of course, but still, when it went on display later, some museum visitors said they felt weird standing near it. Something about it just made people uncomfortable. And that's the thing with objects like this. It's not just about what they're worth or what they were used for, it's about where they were found. A private item meant for quiet, everyday moments, but pulled out of one of the most infamous shipwrecks in history. In 2012, a small metal case was recovered from the wreck, wedged under some debris. Inside was a sealed glass vial filled with thick black liquid. Nobody could say for sure what it was. It wasn't labeled, and it didn't match anything on passenger inventories or supply logs. Some guessed it was ink, maybe used in printing or for ship records. Others weren't so sure. A few reports claimed the liquid behaved strangely when light hit it, forming these faint swirling patterns that looked almost like symbols or writing. Could have been coincidence, could have been some chemical reaction from decades underwater, but it was weird enough that people kept talking about it. The vial was never put on public display. Some say it was just quietly studied, then shelved, but the truth is that no one really knows. There wasn't much follow-up, and official records didn't get into detail. Still, it became one of those Titanic artifacts that people keep asking about, mostly because of those gaps. There's no confirmed use or clear origin, and no solid explanation for how it stayed sealed. Now, I'll admit, I have a hunch it's probably nothing big, but it's just odd enough that people aren't quite ready to let it go. This one's been debated ever since it surfaced. A scrap of paper supposedly found during a dive near the stern section. It was inside a waterproof pouch, the kind meant to keep documents dry in emergencies. The paper was torn, badly damaged, but a few words were still readable. Boilers gone, lights flicker, this may be it. Forgive me. That's all. There was no name or date. The ink had run in places, and the handwriting didn't match any known crew records. Some researchers actually thought that maybe it was a fake planted there, maybe. The note read like someone writing fast, though, under pressure, not expecting to finish the sentence. There's no hard proof either way. If it's authentic, it would be the only written message recovered from the night of the sinking. Written during it, not before. If it's not, it's still one of the more compelling rumors to come out of the wreck. And finally, we have a set of small hair combs found in a pouch recovered from the third class section. Just basic grooming tools wrapped in fabric and packed neatly. There's nothing rare or out of the ordinary about these combs, but finding them like that, clean, arranged, and preserved, it just hit a little differently. They weren't luxury items. They weren't meant to impress anyone. They were just part of someone's normal day. Probably an immigrant heading to America to start over. Most recovered artifacts fall into two categories on the Titanic: big, expensive pieces or things too damaged to recognize. And these didn't fall into either. They were just normal. And that's what made it hard to forget. Not because of what they were, but because of what they said without meaning to. And that, as I've said many times before on these Titanic videos, these were real, everyday people. Some were quite wealthy, of course, but in essence, they were just people with hopes and dreams of a new life across the ocean.
Number 10 is bad luck. Now, the beginning of this journey was full of bad luck, which should have been an omen to turn back. As it was pulling out of the harbor, the ship almost collided with the SS New York. Earlier, during the construction in Belfast, fire had broken out in the coal bunkers. Those are just a few of the bad omens surrounding the ship before it struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank, according to the Titanic disaster, Omens, Mysteries, and Misfortunes of the Doomed Liner, Frontline Books, by British author James Bancroft, his second book about the tragic crossing. The RMS Titanic was the world's largest and most luxurious vessel at the time, a veritable floating palace valued at $7.5 million in 1912. But according to Bancroft, a sense of gloom hung over her. Rumored aboard was the cursed Egyptian mummy's coffin lid, and there are strange events concerning the RMS Titanic than any other ship in history, and the feelings of foreboding and bad omens associated with it suggest the fate had it doomed to a watery grave, writes the author. The iceberg was just the weapon that sent it there. Number 9. Cancelled emergency drill. On April 14th, the day the Titanic struck the iceberg, an emergency lifeboat drill had ironically been scheduled. Now, due to reasons unknown, the drill was cancelled by Captain Smith. If the drill had gone through, many more lives could have been saved. The passengers would have been more likely to follow proper protocol and procedure in loading the lifeboats. You see, a little more than an hour after contact with the iceberg, a largely disorganized evacuation began with lowering the first lifeboat. The craft was designed to hold 65 people, and it left with only 28 aboard. Tragically, this was to be the norm, as during the confusion and chaos during the precious hours before Titanic plunged into the sea, nearly every lifeboat would be launched underfilled, some with only a handful of passengers. Now, in compliance with the law of the sea, women and children boarded the boats first. Only when there were no women or children nearby were men permitted to board. Yet many of the victims were in fact women and children, the result of disorderly procedures that failed to get them to the boats in the first place. If they had done that drill, it could have saved many more lives. Number 8. Construction. The Olympic-class ships featured a double bottom and 15 watertight bulkhead compartments equipped with electric watertight doors that could be operated individually or simultaneously by a switch on the bridge. It was these watertight bulkheads that inspired Shipbuilder magazine, in a special issue devoted to the Olympic liners, to deem them practically unsinkable. But the watertight compartment design contained a flaw that was a critical factor in Titanic's sinking. While the individual bulkheads were indeed watertight, the wall separating the bulkheads extended only a few feet above the waterline, so water could pour from one compartment into another, especially if the ship began to list or pitch forward. Now, the second critical safety lapse that contributed to the loss of so many lives was the inadequate number of lifeboats carried on Titanic. A mere 16 boats plus 4 collapsibles could accommodate just 1,178 people. Now, the Titanic could carry up to 2,435 passengers, and a crew of approximately 900 brought her capacity capacity to more than 3,000 people. As a result, even if the lifeboats were loaded to full capacity during an emergency evacuation, there were only available seats for only 1/3 of those on board. With all these issues, it's no shock that the tragedy had happened. Number 7. Violet Jessup was on board. Because Violet Jessup was on board, to me, it seems like the ship was doomed. Now, if you don't know who she is, let me introduce her to you. In 1911, she began working as a stewardess for the White Star Line's RMS Olympic. Violet was on board on September 20th, 1911, when Olympic left from Southampton and collided with the British warship HMS Hawke. Now, despite damage, the ship was able to make it back to port without sinking. She then continued to work on Olympic until April 1912, when she was transferred to the sister ship, the Titanic. Violet boarded the RMS Titanic as a stewardess on April 10th, 1912. 4 days later, on April 14th, it struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank about 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision. She was later ordered into Lifeboat 16, and as the boat was being lowered, one of Titanic's officers gave her a baby to look after. Now, the next morning, Violet and the rest of the survivors were rescued by the RMS Carpathia and taken to New York City on April 18th. Then, in the First World War, Violet was a stewardess on the British Red Cross, and on the morning of November 21st, 1916, she was aboard HMHS Britannic, the younger sister ship of the Olympic and Titanic that had been converted into a hospital ship, when it sank in the Aragon Sea after an unexplained explosion. It seems like no matter what ship she was on, it sank.
This is another conspiracy theory about the Titanic intentionally being sabotaged, this time by foreign agents. The Titanic was said to be this unsinkable titan of a ship, so what better place to transport highly sensitive military or diplomatic cargo? You wouldn't think this would be a great place to transport stuff like that, what with all the civilians on board, plus you got all those rowdy fiddlers partying down in the lower decks, but there's something to be said for hiding in plain sight. Now, what could this highly sensitive material have been? Well, who knows? Point is, maybe someone caught wind of what was on there, and the Titanic was intentionally sunk by foreign agents or intelligence agencies trying to obtain or destroy these classified materials. As for how the Titanic sank, there are all kinds of ways it could have been sabotaged. Maybe someone on the crew was even involved, crashing into that big old iceberg on purpose. Sounds far-fetched, but I'm just relaying some of the wild, crazy stuff that's been said online. Also, buckle up, because it just gets nuttier from here on out.
That it does, because next up we have the theory that the ship was cursed by a mummy who wanted revenge on those who had disturbed its burial and stolen its things, some of which just so happened to be aboard the Titanic when it sank. William Stead, who had boarded the vessel alongside Margaret Brown, who had been transporting some of the artifacts, had spoken about the mummy's curse many times in the years leading up to the wreck. He said that its presence had caused many mysterious disasters and much destruction in London, where the mummy was being kept, claiming that the mummy and its items had been cursed. Whether the ship went down due to an iceberg accident, a fire, or a planned insurance scam, I'm sure the presence of cursed artifacts certainly didn't help the situation.
Alright, I'm doing it. I'm actually going here. I'm throwing time travel into the mix. Now, I'm not making this up. This is a conspiracy theory that really does exist. It's actually a pretty fun theory as well, so hear me out. The idea here is that the Titanic was intentionally sabotaged by time travelers from the future. In some other timeline, history went very differently. The Titanic made it to New York City, and stepping off the boat was a passenger who would change the course of history completely, for the worst. As for what happened, the possibilities are really endless. Maybe this person became an evil dictator, maybe they invented something that brought humanity to the edge of extinction, who the hell knows. But time travelers from this awful future decided to pull a Terminator and go back through time to prevent this individual from arriving in the Big Apple in the first place by sinking the Titanic, thus altering the timeline and preventing a very dark future, sacrificing 1,500 or so people in order to save who knows how many. Very outlandish, but great idea for a movie. It's very Star Trek-y.
Next up, iceberg? No. German torpedo? Maybe. Going off what James said about foreign agencies possibly targeting the Titanic. Some people actually believe that prior to World War II, German U-boats had been deployed around the waters of England in order to keep close watch on their British adversaries. It is possible that one of the boats dedicated to keeping tabs on the Brits accidentally, or perhaps purposefully, fired one of their weapons at the Titanic. Perhaps it wasn't an iceberg that caused damage to the ship's starboard hull, but instead a massive torpedo fired from the ship of foreign enemies. Survivors of the wreck did report a vessel lurking miles away from the ship until the early morning, and thought it odd that it never came to aid in rescue efforts. While this one is pretty far out there, when it comes to the Titanic, really anything is possible, including time travel apparently. And hell, maybe they were hired by JP Morgan. I mean, he did have extensive business dealings with the German government, so is it really that far-fetched? Probably.
This next theory posits that the Titanic met its tragic end due to recklessness, all in the name of breaking a record. The Titanic was going pretty fast, about 21.5 knots, which was close to its top speed when it hit the iceberg. And some folks think that Captain Edward Smith was going that fast because the big boss of the company, J. Bruce Ismay, wanted to show off and beat the record for crossing the Atlantic Ocean. But the Titanic wasn't built to be a speed demon, it was built to be fancy and luxurious. But was this high speed a contributing factor in the ship's demise? Very possible. The impact may not have been as severe, and they may have been able to get out of the way faster.
In our number 10 spot, we have the Reddit story. This story comes from Reddit user NextGuitar2992, and they were replying to a post asking if anybody remembers being on the Titanic in a past life. They replied with, quote, "Maybe? I'm one who's on the fence about past lives and such, but I don't know about this. I'm obsessed with the Titanic, and I asked my mom as a joke if I maybe reincarnated from it, and she said without hesitation, yes you are. Which got me thinking. I knew about the Titanic before I could even speak. She says that even as a 1-year-old, I was drawing the ship as best as I could and drawn to the ship. The first time I saw A Night to Remember and the Titanic 1997, the sinking scenes just felt off. Even the breakup in the 97 movie, I said, that's not right. Mind you, I was around 4 to 6 when I saw it, and I was right. The sinking scenes in both movies are said to be inaccurate. I've always known the fourth funnel was for decoration when no one else around me knew. I've always had an obsession with the second class areas. I've always hated water, literally for no reason. I just hate it and I don't know why. Same goes for cold. I can't handle anything under 45 degrees or I'll have a panic attack. Again, I don't know why, it just happens. I've always been looking up facts and such about the Titanic, and when I look up the lost ladies, I had a major anxiety attack. Never happened before when I was reading things about other survivors and victims. And lastly, I've always had an obsession with the Titanic and its stories, and I still do. Could just be coincidence, but sometimes I wonder. In our number 9 spot today, we have Jessica Brooks. Jessica is an accomplished violinist with a profound connection to a tragic chapter in maritime history because she firmly believes that she had a past life on the Titanic, not as a passenger, but as a member of the ship's orchestra, playing music that echoed through the grand halls of the doomed vessel. Her claim is supported by an uncanny and detailed knowledge of the Titanic's musical repertoire, despite having never studied it in her current life. Even more compelling is her unusual affinity towards the hymn Nearer My God to Thee. This hymn is notably significant as it's widely spread to have been the last song played by the Titanic's band as the ship succumbed to the icy waters of the North Atlantic. This strong emotional connection to the hymn and her vivid past life memories make Brooks' case exceptionally compelling. In our number 8 spot today, we have Lucinda Green. Lucinda is a woman with an uncanny and heart-wrenching connection to the Titanic. Green's ties to the ship trace back to her childhood when, long before she learned about the ill-fated vessel, she would draw detailed images of a large ship colliding with an iceberg. This peculiar fixation turned out to be the tip of the iceberg of her mysterious link to the Titanic. As Green grew older, she began to express detailed memories of a past life. She insisted that she had been Mary, a nanny aboard the Titanic tasked with the care of 2 young children. Her recollections were far from rosy nostalgia. She described the deafening chaos of the ship sinking, the shrieks of metal, the panicked cries of passengers, the chilling sound of wailing. Most distressingly, she remembers being helplessly separated from her charges amidst the confusion, a memory that brought her great distress. What makes Green's story story all the more captivating is its corroboration by historical facts. Records from the Titanic reveal that there was indeed a nanny named Mary aboard the ship who tragically lost those under her care. This astonishing alignment between Green's memories and documented history lends considerable weight to her claims. In our number 7 spot today, we have the birthday connection. This past life story comes from a Reddit user called lowstick6746, and they wrote about how their initial Titanic connection comes from the fact that their birthday falls on April 18th, the day when the Titanic survivors reached New York. However, her connection to the ill-fated ship remains elusive, confined to dreams of witnessing its construction and fleeting glimpses of elegant, well-dressed individuals from a distance. These encounters evoke a sense of observing a higher social class without being a part of it, leaving her with a feeling of detachment. A cruise she embarked on shortly after the release of the Titanic film proved to be an eventful journey. Amidst the challenges of rough seas, a peculiar incident occurred. One evening after dinner, she strolled along an exterior promenade and a distinct familiarity overcame her. The chilly air, the sound of her shoes on the deck, everything seemed eerily recognizable. Looking down, she caught a glimpse of her shoes and the wet decking, triggering a sense of deja vu. Her mind connected the dots, recalling that her shoes were once black, much like her dress in that dream. It was an odd realization since she had never owned a black dress in her waking life. Despite her strong affinity for the Titanic, she lacks any fascination or interest in other ships, leading her to question the extent of her involvement. In our number 6 spot today, we have William Barnes. In his early childhood, William Barnes exhibited signs that hinted at a connection to the ill-fated Titanic in a past life. At the tender age of 4, he astounded his parents by drawing a ship with 4 smokestacks and declaring, "This is my ship, but she died." Curiously, he insisted on being called Tommy and spoke of siblings, aunts, uncles, and brothers who were unknown to his parents, as well as troubling nightmares that plagued his sleep. Years later, at the age of 25, having relocated to Washington, D.C., William sought the guidance of a counselor proficient in hypnosis. During one session, he engaged in a fervent debate about the ship's design while under a trance, and upon emerging, he declared with certainty, "My name is Tommy Andrews." This marked the first time that he had uttered the complete name. At 38, after embarking on a new marriage and moving to Arizona, William startled his wife, Mary Ann, during a restless night's sleep, passionately arguing and uttering unfamiliar names with a very distinct accent. Ultimately, these strange occurrences affected his life so much, and finally in 1997 he was referred to Dr. Frank Baranowski, a psychologist renowned for employing hypnotic age regression to aid individuals in overcoming phobias. Initially skeptical, William approached the regression sessions with doubt, convinced that they would be futile. However, to his astonishment, the therapy proved effective for him. The sessions were meticulously recorded and later released, and in the recordings, listeners can hear William speaking as Tommy Andrews with his distinctive Irish accent, recounting the harrowing events of the Titanic sinking and reliving his own tragic demise on the ship's deck. In our number 5 spot today, we have family ties. Lorraine Allison was just 2 years old when she boarded the Titanic with her family, her parents, and her brother. At the time of the sinking, it is said that Lorraine's brother was rushed to a lifeboat, but that the other 3 members of the family had passed in the tragedy. Despite this, only Lorraine's father's body was found, which led to the question of what happened to Lorraine and her mother. 28 years later, a woman named Helen Kramer came forward and said that she, in fact, was the missing Lorraine. Of course, people were skeptical and weren't willing to believe this, but until her death in 1992, Helen continued to claim that she was in fact Lorraine. After her passing, her granddaughter, Debrina Woods, resurfaced the claims by saying that she had inherited more evidence from her grandmother and that the truth should be told. Finally, a group of Titanic researchers, with the power of modern science, decided that they all wanted to solve this mystery once and for all. They did this by convincing descendants from each family to take a DNA test, and once this was done, they were able to prove that there was no relationship between the two. They were finally able to put this long disputed claim to rest officially. In our number 4 spot today, we have the telegraph. So you know how people often explain that perhaps many more people would have been saved from the Titanic wreck if the nearby SS Californian had their telegraph operator awake when the distress call was sent? For the man who went to sleep, that's a heavy burden to bear for the rest of your life, but a recent study suggests that even if he was awake, there likely wouldn't have been anything that he could have done. Firstly, there wasn't any rule stating that this guy needed to be awake for 24 hours to man the telegraph machine, so right here, he is off the hook. This study, however, suggests that even if he was awake and the ship received the distress call, the ice around the Titanic was so thick they likely wouldn't have been able to get through to save the passengers either way. Turns out that this disaster really just had the perfect recipe for tragedy. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Titanic radio. This is a piece of the ship that has not yet been recovered, but it's the focus of much debate on whether or not it should be retrieved from the wreckage. Known in 1912 as the Marconi wireless telegraph machine, the radio on the Titanic sent distress calls to nearby ships that ended up saving the lives of 700 people in lifeboats. Despite how many people died in the Titanic tragedy, there were debates about whether or not to retrieve the artifact because of the fact that there might still be remains located in the same area as the radio is. Lawyers have argued against the recovery of the radio because the dive plan did not include the prospect of there being human remains located down there. It also was argued because in order to retrieve it, they would need to cut into the ship's radio compartment, which was strongly opposed by preservation advocates. As of right now, it does appear as though the dive to retrieve the radio will still occur, but of course the pandemic delayed things quite a bit, so at this point it isn't exactly clear when. This radio would be a very valuable artifact, but it also would hold an eerie tale of exactly when and how the radio was used during the final moments of the Titanic. In our number 2 spot today, we have the inspection card. This inspection card once belonged to a woman named Marion Meanwell. What could possibly be worrisome about an inspection card? Well, it shows how Marion was not intended to be on the Titanic, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of the passengers. The card shows that she was originally meant to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic. For some reason, the trip she originally had planned was delayed, and she instead was assigned to the ill-fated Titanic. You can see that the word Majestic was crossed out on her card, which shows us the change in plans. If only people were able to see what was about to strike and they could have warned her. If Marion's body was ever recovered, unfortunately, she has never been identified. In our number 1 spot today, we have the bell. The bell from the crow's nest of the Titanic was recovered from the wreckage and returned to land, where it now resides in the Titanic Museum. The eerie story behind this bell is that it would have been the one that was rung 3 times by the lookout Frederick Fleet in order to attempt to warn of the iceberg that was ahead. Frederick, as well as the other lookout who was with him, Reginald Lee, both ended up thankfully surviving the incident and went on to later explain what happened from their point of view. They explained that if they had been given binoculars to assist with their job, they could have seen the iceberg sooner. When asked how much sooner, Frederick replied, quote, "Well, enough to get out of the way."
Starting us off at number 10, we have the final resting place. When it comes to Titanic-related hauntings, it should come as no big surprise that the actual site where the tragedy occurred is considered one of the most haunted spots of all. According to those who have visited since the fateful day, strange sights such as odd glowing orbs of light can be seen floating around at night, and many believe they are actually the spirits of those who died at sea. But that's not all. Deep sea vessels that have explored the area near the sinking have reported to receive eerie, faint SOS calls that fade in and out, and seem to have no traceable source. Could they be the ghosts of the fallen crying out for help? Many definitely believe so. Now, orbs of light and radio static are nowhere near unheard of when it comes to suspected paranormal activity, especially when you're dealing with a place such as this, where so many people have perished. However, the most terrifying curse of all has to do with an old legend that says if you aren't careful, the lonely ghosts in the sea may just pull you overboard to live the rest of eternity with them. So just be safe if you are sailing in the area. Coming in at number 9, Titanic's builder. Inside the Titanic exhibit in the Luxor Hotel is a portrait of a man named J. Bruce Ismay, who was one of the builders of the Titanic many years ago. However, the thing about Ismay was that he's not really what you would describe as a hero. Apparently, he fled the sinking ship, leaving women and their families behind, and witnesses on the lifeboats claim he kept his back to the ship as it descended. But worst of all, it said he was the one insisting the ship speed up after receiving ice warnings, and as a result, it's believed he is not terribly liked by the ghosts who did not survive the disaster. In fact, one morning in particular, as the crew came in to open the exhibit, they found the portrait of Ismay on the floor. When the manager watched the surveillance video from the night before, he was stunned to see the picture began shaking before coming off of the wall, seemingly all by itself. Many believe that those who perished that night haunt the exhibit, tearing down his photo, and some believe that if you aren't careful, they may just curse you for being associated with him. Coming in at number 8, no Pope. So this next one is kind of a full conspiracy, but you know what? I just couldn't help myself. Apparently, one of the myths that supports the idea that the ship was cursed comes from the ship's number. The number in question was allegedly 390904, but some Catholic employees who built the ship were distressed at the time as the number, when viewed in a mirror, appears to say no Pope. Apparently this meant that the ship was cursed and godless in their eyes, and that, coupled with someone allegedly saying that God could not sink the ship, made for one giant cursed vessel. To be honest, I'm not sure how much of this myth is based in fact and how much of it is a glorified legend, but I'm not out to tempt fate in the same way the Titanic did all those years ago. Coming in at number 7, Ghost of the Titanic. One can assume that there are as many ghosts as there were fatalities associated with the infamous sinking of the ship, but one of the most famous is thought to be that of Frederick Fleet. Frederick was a British sailor serving as the lookout aboard the RMS Titanic, and it was Frederick who actually spotted the deadly iceberg and warned the bridge. But tragically, as we know, his warning came too late and the ship was not able to avoid the disastrous collision. However, the saddest part was that although Fleet survived the sinking of the Titanic, he suffered deeply from depression, in part to his survivor's guilt, and tragically his depression only grew worse over time. Finally, after his wife's passing just after Christmas in 1964 and the shortly followed eviction from his brother-in-law, Frederick took his own life. Following his death, he was buried, but strangely his grave remained unmarked until the Titanic Historical Society erected a headstone for him in 1993. These days, however, it appears his spirit is not quite at rest, as witnesses have claimed to see him keeping watch over the Las Vegas exhibition's promenade deck, perhaps driven by his guilt to watch even in the afterlife. Next up at number 6, a ghost on board. Back in 1977, Second Officer Leonard Bishop of the SS Winter Haven gave a tour of the ship to a man who he naturally assumed was a passenger. Apparently the man was British and very soft-spoken, but extremely interested in every detail of the vessel, almost unusually so. Bishop found the man to be a bit strange, but didn't think much of it, and continued to tour him around. But it wasn't until a few years later, when he saw a photo of Titanic Captain Edward John Smith, that Officer Bishop realized why the situation felt so off. Allegedly, he exclaimed to a friend, "I know him, I gave him a tour of my boat." But the friend laughed and explained to his friend that the man had been long dead and that the man he claimed to know was the captain of the Titanic. Turns out the captain still remains at sea and likes to check up on the passing boats. Let's just hope he's not looking to be vengeful. Coming in at number 5, Lady in Black. Almost any haunted location has some kind of Lady in Black. I'm not sure exactly why, but it just happens to be part of the brand. And the Titanic Artifact exhibition is no exception. Employees and guests alike all claim to have seen this mysterious woman, and it's said she wears a black period dress with a white collar and her hair in a bun. However, the most eerie of stories surrounding this ghost has to do with a photographer. Reportedly, he was getting ready for the opening of an exhibition when he spotted this woman casually walking down the grand staircase. He was understandably startled, as he hadn't noticed anyone enter and the staircase was roped off, but he just assumed he must have missed her come in and that she was a part of the exhibit. So, trying to be friendly, he asked if she'd like him to photograph her, but she ignored him. So he went back to setting up. But suddenly, she was directly behind him. So again, he offered a photograph. But this time, she didn't just ignore him, she vanished right before his very eyes. It's believed she is a ghost of a woman who died on the ship, and while no one knows exactly who she might be, let's just hope she's not a dangerous spirit.
In our number 5 spot today, we have the card. In the remnants of the Titanic, there was an inspection card found that belonged to a woman named Marion Meanwell. This may seem like a mundane find, but it revealed a very grim story for the woman. Once the card was found, it was revealed that Marion was not intended to be on the Titanic that day, but by some turn of events, she unfortunately found herself as one of the passengers. The card showed that she was originally meant to be traveling on a ship called the Majestic. For some reason, the trip she originally had planned was delayed, and she instead was assigned to the ill-fated Titanic. You can see that the word Majestic was crossed out on her card, which shows us the change in plans. There clearly is no way anyone could have known or warned her. It's just a really tragic situation all around. In our number 4 spot today, we have slow action. While we were just talking about lifeboats, I mentioned how there wasn't enough time to launch all of the ones on board. This is true, and while the Titanic sank fairly quickly, there would have been more time if only people were more prepared. What I mean is that from the point where the ship actually hit the iceberg until the first lifeboats were launched was an entire hour. That is way too long when it is an emergency of this magnitude, which obviously leaves us wondering why. Well, as it turns out, a lot of people thought that the alarm bells were actually just a drill, and they stayed inside where it was warm. This is already terrible, but what's even worse is that for the people who didn't think it was a drill, they had absolutely no idea where to go or what to do in the case of an emergency. They had never done any lifeboat drills, so everyone was just panicking with nowhere to go. Due to this lifeboat delay, there wasn't enough time to launch all of the remaining lifeboats successfully. This means that there are likely many lives that could have been saved had they had some more direction or prior training. In our number 3 spot today, we have ignored help. Only 20 miles away from the location of the sinking of the Titanic was another boat called the SS Californian. This boat had stopped in order to avoid the ice, which was clearly a fantastic idea. What is pretty insane, however, is that the captain of this boat actually saw the emergency flares being set off on the Titanic, but he ignored them because he figured they were company rockets. And to make this matter even worse, the SOS signals that the Titanic was sending out weren't even received until the next day because the radio operator on the SS Californian had gone to sleep. By the time they heard these calls and arrived the next day, everyone had unfortunately already passed away and they weren't able to save anyone. Who knows what could have happened had they taken those emergency signals seriously? It's obviously not their fault, but it definitely makes you think. In our number 2 spot today, we have the band. We know how passionate musicians can be, and we know how healing music is for a lot of people. While I am absolutely sure that there was nothing that could be done to completely erase people's worries about what was going on, the ship's orchestra did what they could, which was to play music. The 8 orchestra members continued to play as the ship sank in order to try and keep spirits up, I'm sure for other passengers as well as themselves. At first it was widely believed that they did this because they were ordered to, and for the record, if this were the case, that would still have been insanely brave of them, but as it turns out, this is far from true. The band members were in fact not ship employees, which means that they had the same rights as any passenger to leave, but they chose not to. They all unfortunately passed away in the sinking of the ship, and they played until they couldn't anymore, which I think is horribly sad, but also very beautiful and heroic of them. I'm sure that their heroism helped a lot of people who were also in this terrible situation, and I'm glad that their acts have been remembered even still. In our number 1 spot today, we have wrong turn. Okay, so we talked about how many warnings about the iceberg were ignored, but what happened when people finally stopped ignoring them? Well, once the iceberg was actually spotted, the chief officer received this warning and he ordered the helmsman to turn the wheel. Apparently this was actually a huge mistake, but it's unlikely they would have known that at the time. Researchers now believe that if they hadn't turned the wheel, the ship might not have sunk. The ship itself had bulkheads in the bow, so it is very likely that had the ship collided head-on with the iceberg, it actually would have been fine. They said that a head-on collision would have either stopped the ship from sinking at all, or it would have at least sunk a lot more slowly, which would have given more time for people to be rescued. It's easy for us to look back and say this would have been the best move, but under that kind of pressure, it's tough to see things as clearly as we can right now.
now. At our number 10 spot, we have the couldn't shower woman. This person on Reddit mentioned that throughout her whole life, she has been obsessed with the Titanic, but in a way where she has always feared it. Her biggest fear was the Titanic for so long, not bugs or monsters under the bed. It was always the Titanic. She subsequently feared water because she would constantly have flashes of being on the Titanic when in water, and especially if it was cold. Her memories and thoughts were so vivid that she actually had a hard time showering and would have her sister sit in the bathroom with her until she was 17 years old. Whenever she would see pictures of sunken ships, and specifically when she saw pics of the Titanic, she would get anxious, even though sometimes she would seek them out. She doesn't have any specific memories, just flashes of staring up at the boat as it was sinking, and it has completely altered her life. That's wild. Imagine being so scared that you would literally need someone to be in the bathroom with you while you shower. She either was actually on the Titanic or she really needs to speak to someone about her active imagination. That would be so terrifying to experience. In our number 9 spot, we have The Water is Coming. A woman's son that chose to remain nameless had an obsession with the Titanic. He was constantly talking about the Titanic and wanting to watch the movie, and so one day she decided to take him to the Titanic exhibit. After going there, he began to have night terrors, and one night in particular she would never forget. She was watching TV when she heard loud banging in her son's room. She went inside to see him on all fours and heard him yell, "Go, go, go, the water is coming." And then he let out a scream. But it wasn't his voice. It was the voice of an older man coming out of him. Apparently after that incident, her son started to talk about it less, and she chalked it up to that maybe his soul had come to terms with the catastrophe and was more at peace. Wow. I definitely would have been extremely terrified if I had witnessed this. I wouldn't have been able to go back to sleep, at least, that's for sure. In our number 8 spot, we have Michael Kushner. A TikToker and photographer by the name of Michael Kushner explained his Titanic story and how he has memories from the incident. In his explanation, he spoke about how around 7 years old is when you start to lose your memories from a past life, and when he was 7, he saw the Titanic movie 4 times, and every time he saw the sinking scene, he felt that something wasn't right. Throughout his life, the Titanic followed him everywhere. When he moved to London, it was the 100-year anniversary, and on the day he landed, a ship sunk, and everyone was saying that it was just like the Titanic. The first playbill he ever photographed was called The Unsinkable Molly Brown. And even James Cameron, the director of the Titanic, said he didn't feel the sinking scene was depicted accurately and explained why, and Michael said that his explanation aligned with what he felt. Out of all of the stories that I'm going to tell you about today, this guy definitely feels like he could have been on the Titanic in another life. Would love to know your thoughts in the comment section below. In our number 7 spot, we have Paul Emerald. Paul Emerald is a Los Angeles producer that took part in a series of past life regressions for a television show he was working on. What he found, though, led to a journey that he did not expect, and he even wrote a book on it. He was convinced for so long that he wasn't going to live past the age of 25, and when he started doing these regressions, he realized that he had a lot of weird similarities with a passenger that died on the ship named John Jack Phillips, who was 25 when the boat sank. He decided to visit John's hometown, and it was there that he experienced major deja vu, like he knew where everything was. So he did some more regressions and saw John's whole life. He is convinced that John was him in another life. Wow, that's an incredible story. Imagine just going to a random town and knowing where everything is because you were there in another life.
Next up at number 4, a premonition. As the legend goes, on the very same night the ship went down, a young Scottish woman by the name of Jessie was on the verge of dying. It's said that in her delirious state, she supposedly spoke of a massive sinking ship and a man named Wally playing a fiddle, despite the fact that she would have no way of knowing the Titanic would sink that night. Unless she was placing some kind of curse, that is. I have to say the most insane part of the legend is that a man named Wallace, aka Wally Hartley, did indeed play his violin one last time as he and his band went down with the ship. Let's just hope some women on her deathbed wasn't the reason this all happened. Coming in at number 3, the unlucky mummy. One of the most well-known alleged curses surrounding the Titanic is that of the unlucky mummy. Now, for a little context, approximately 1,000 years before the time of Christ, a woman who has since been dubbed a priestess of the College of Amun-Ra was born in the city of Thebes, Egypt, and it is believed this mummy is her embalmed body. Now, in terms of the unluckiness surrounding her mummy, in the late 1890s, archaeologists discovered the burial site during a dig near Egypt's lost city of Luxor. According to legend, a rich Englishman arranged for the purchase of the mummy and her casket. However, as reported by the Museum of Unnatural History, the man inexplicably vanished before his purchase could be delivered. Then later, all 3 of his travel companions suffered misfortune. One of the men died, another was disabled in an accident, and the third suffered financial ruin. From that day forward, it was believed that anyone or anything that this mummy came into contact with would be cursed by misfortune, and rumors suggest that the mummy was eventually purchased by an American archaeologist who arranged for it to be transported to the United States aboard the Titanic. So, for all we know, some ancient cursed mummy could have cursed the ship and sent it to its dark fate. Coming in at number 2, missing tourists. If there was ever an argument to be made for scary curses surrounding the Titanic, then this next story is probably the one I would pick. You may or may not have seen and heard the terrifying story that is unfolding as we speak, but essentially there was a tourist submarine that set out to tour the wreckage of the Titanic that has now been missing for over 48 hours. The missing vessel has 5 people on board, including British billionaire Hamish Harding, French diver Paul-Henri Nargeolet, Pakistani entrepreneur Shahzad Dawood with his son, and the final passenger is believed to be Stockton Rush, the founder of Ocean Gate Expeditions. The submarine dove down on Sunday morning, but after only an hour and 45 minutes into the tour, they lost all communication. Now, besides the obviously nerve-wracking part of this all, what is really scary is that according to OceanGate's website, the submarine can only last for up to 96 hours underwater with 5 people consuming oxygen. So the clock is ticking for the search and rescue team to try and track down the disappearing vessel before it's too late. It is truly a horrific and nightmare-inducing situation, and many believe that the waters surrounding the haunted ship are to blame. And last up in our number 1 spot today is the wreck of the Titan. There are many conspiracy theories surrounding the Titanic, one being that it never actually set sail, another being that it deliberately sunk, but to be honest, none of them really hold much validity. However, there is one interesting conspiracy theory, and that is that a man named Morgan Robertson actually predicted and potentially even cursed the infamous ship when he published his novel The Wreck of the Titan in 1898, 14 years before the real-life disaster. Now, to be clear, Robertson rejected any claims stating that he had something to do with the disaster, and insisted he was just drawing on his own real-life experiences as a sailor. But I have to admit, some of the similarities between his story and the real-life events are a little creepy. For example, even if you ignore that they had similar names, the fictitious Titan, like the Titanic, was supposed to be the largest of its kind and an unsinkable ship. Plus, it also lacked enough lifeboats to accommodate its passenger load, and struck an iceberg while going too fast in the North Atlantic. And as if that weren't strangely similar enough, both disasters took place in April and cost thousands of people their lives. So, do you think this book was some kind of curse on the ship, or just a really creepy coincidence?
10th spot, we have the heads up. I'm not sure why, but for actual years, I thought that on the day of the Titanic sinking, the iceberg they hit just kind of came out of nowhere and surprised them. So imagine my surprise when I found out that wasn't true even in the slightest. It turns out the entire thing could have been avoided. The crew had received 6 warnings about the iceberg before the collision. While the first few warnings were received by the captain, not all of them were, and it's not totally clear why. Although the crew knew about the icy conditions on the water, they didn't slow down much, which some have called a reckless decision, but apparently this was standard practice at the time, so I suppose you can't really blame them. The final warning, however, was received from a ship that had halted for the night due to an ice field a few miles away, and when the message was being relayed to the captain, he cut it off and said to shut up as he was working Cape Race. In our number 9 spot today, we have the futility. This is more so something that happened prior to the fateful day of the Titanic sinking, but it's still quite unsettling and also kind of bizarre nonetheless. In 1898, a book called Futility was released by an author named Morgan Robertson. This book tells the story of a large ship named the Titan. The Titan sets out for its first sail but encounters and strikes an iceberg. This certainly sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? Considering this book was released in 1898 and the real-life event of the Titanic sinking happened in 1912, there are many people who believe that this novel predicted this fateful day. It's most likely a very strange coincidence, but man is it really weird. Even with the names being so close, let alone how the rest of the story just matches up so well. Maybe Morgan Robertson is a time traveler or some kind of prophet, but if he was to guess, it would be kind of rude to just write a book about it rather than, I don't know, warn someone? In our number 8 spot today, we have True Love. Two of the first class passengers who were on the ship were elderly couple Isidore and Ida Stratus. When the ship started to sink and lifeboats were being boarded, attendants were ushering Ida into one of the lifeboats, but of course without her husband, since women and children were being rescued first. Ida, however, refused to leave her husband, and Isidore refused to be rescued before other men. Instead, they both chose to stay on the ship and they went down together. Ida said, quote, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so we will die. Together." Survivors who witnessed their love last saw the pair standing on the deck with their arms around each other. This love story is incredibly tragic, but also just such a testament to how much they loved each other. I am very glad that they had one another in those very frightening moments. In our number 7 spot today, we have Take My Spot. John Jacob Astor was one of the first class passengers on the ship that day. As the ship was sinking, he put his young wife on one of the lifeboats and he was about to get in with her when he saw two absolutely terrified children standing behind him. He instead gave up his spot and let those two children on the boat, which is both noble, but it's also just the right thing to do. One of the Titanic survivors named Philip Mock saw John in one of his final moments. He saw him and his valet huddled together on one of the life rafts before they unfortunately froze in the cold water. This was indeed a very tragic event, but the positive news is that both his wife and the child she was carrying at the time were able to make it to safety and survive the whole ordeal, which also likely means that the children he gave his spot up for also survived. While there are many terrible stories from this day, we also hear quite a few about the bravery people showed during this tragic event. In our number 6 spot today, we have the lifeboat. Before the Titanic set sail during the preparation for the journey, at some point, people made a decision to reduce the number of lifeboats that were on board. They did this because they didn't want to clutter the deck, which is truly trivial when we are talking about the safety of the 2,208 passengers that were on board that day. The number of lifeboats ended up being reduced to just 20, with an additional 4 that were collapsible. This meant that, should they have had time to launch every single one, this would still only be enough for half of the passengers on board. That's a terrible ratio. And, as you may or may not know, during the sinking of the ship, not even all of the lifeboats were able to be launched as everything happened too quickly. There are quite a few lessons that can be and definitely were learned from the sinking of the Titanic, because the more we learn, the more we realize that the safety precautions taken for the ship simply were just not up to par.
In our number 6 spot, we have the mysterious Reddit user. This is told by a Reddit user who explained that he always had a fascination with the Titanic and an overwhelming amount of sadness and empathy around the situation. He explains that he's not a very empathetic person, but for some reason he feels an increased amount of empathy for those that died on the ship. This user always freaks out when it comes to water, and drowning is one of their biggest fears. They did a past life meditation to see if they could get a name, but only got a picture of being somewhere cold and icy. So interesting. I think it's possible that maybe there's a lot of people out there that didn't actually die on the Titanic, but they did die on like a shipwreck in a past life, and then maybe it would make sense why they would resonate with the Titanic, but Who knows? In our number 5 spot, we have A Love to Remember. A 19-year-old woman by the name of Amanda remembered being on the Titanic with her past love. She remembered being a first-class passenger by the name of Julia who met her man named Mark on board the ship. They both ended up taking a lifeboat together and surviving the disaster, and later on ended up getting married. Amanda said that she has a hard time finding love in her life nowadays because no one quite meets the standards of her previous love. Aw, that's sweet and terribly sad. Hopefully she ends up finding him again in this life. In our number 4 spot, we have the claustrophobic man. This person is another Reddit user that very much considers themselves to have died on the Titanic in a past life, and their justification? They hate being cold and can't swim well. Interesting. He said, "I'm deeply claustrophobic, and so maybe I got trapped somehow, but all I know is that I've been deeply fascinated by the Titanic and the movie." Do you think it's possible that the movie casted some kind of spell on people around the world, and because it felt so lifelike, people just felt as if they were there? Another user commented that they did lock passengers in the steerage, so it's possible this person was one of those passengers. Coming up in our number 3 spot, we have the girl with the green eyes. This person believed they were on the Titanic because of a past life regression circle that they took part in. This person is a part of a pagan group, and one day they were doing a past life regression exercise, and she saw herself go down a long hallway with white walls and wood paneling and a plush red carpet and a fancy wooden door at the end of the hallway. Honestly, this sounds like the final scene from the movie, but I'm gonna go on. Anyway, she goes into a room filled with water, and a girl comes up to her with piercing green eyes and a blue lily crystal hairpin in her hair. Her eyes were filled with tears. They got into a lifeboat together, but then the girl got out and continued to hold her hand. Once they lowered the boat, her hand slipped from the girl's hand as they were separated. Interesting. I swear something like that happens in the movie as well. I really wonder what people were saying before the movie came out and if their experiences were described similarly then. In our number 2 spot, we have Alfred Peacock. A young boy that was born 2 years after the sinking of the Titanic would have tons of visions of being on the Titanic growing up. He felt that he was on the Titanic and couldn't imagine any other explanations for his visions. He remembered being a young boy on the Titanic and that he lived in the 3rd class cabin with his family. He remembered that his name started with an A and ended with an E and a D, and that led him to think that his name was Alfred. After doing some research of the passengers that died on the ship, he came across an Alfred Peacock that was young on the ship, and he believed that his memories were then confirmed. In our number 1 spot, we have Charles Latoller. A man remembers being a passenger on the Titanic that went by the name of Charles Latoller. Charles was a British sailor who was a 2nd officer on board the Titanic. He did not die on the Titanic, he was one of the survivors, and went on to live till the 50s. So this person must not be too old if he feels that he really was him in another life. He has flashes of walking down the staircase on the ship and seeing beautiful gowns. He always felt connected to the Titanic, and after discovering a picture of Charles, he knew he felt a connection with it, and he felt that it was himself. In June of 2001, when he was writing a book about the Titanic, a woman randomly came up to him in a coffee shop and told him that he was on the Titanic, and opened up one of his research books of the Titanic and pointed to an officer, and sure enough, she pointed to Charles Latoller. Freaky!
Spot, we have the vanishing remains. It's been over 30 years since the Titanic wreck was found, and recently scientists have made another startling discovery. As it turns out, the remains of the wreckage don't have much time left. As we speak, they are currently vanishing. The ocean liner, which is over 100 years old, has not only been beaten by the currents of the deep sea, but the main culprit for its deterioration is an iron-hungry bacteria that consumes hundreds of pounds of iron a day. This bacteria, which has been named Halomonas titanicae, is likely going to render the ship completely eroded by 2030. This means that researchers who want to discover more about the Titanic really are racing against time to get down there and see all that they can before the remains are gone, and the story of the Titanic remains just that. In our number 9 spot today, we have portholes. Since the Titanic sunk, people have been trying to figure out exactly how this unsinkable ship sank and how it sank so quickly. A recent study may have found a previously undiscussed scenario that likely contributed to the speed of the sinking ship greatly. On that fateful day, of course, the Titanic grinded to a halt, and at that point the passengers had no idea why. This led to many of them opening up the portholes in the ship to get a look out in case they could see anything that would be stopping them from continuing on their journey. Many of those who opened the portholes didn't close them after, and with every open porthole that went underwater, it is estimated that it doubled the size of the damage to the ship. It is possible that these open windows may have caused the ship to sink at double the rate it would have had those windows been closed. Of course, this is not to blame the passengers, however, as this tragedy is certainly not their fault. In our number 8 spot today, we have the brittle fracture. This is another one of those theories behind how the Titanic found itself at the bottom of the North Atlantic. There was an expedition down to the wreckage of the Titanic recently, and it revealed something interesting about the hull of the ship. There were these large pieces of steel that were recovered, each with about 3 rivet holes 1.25 inches in diameter. These pieces revealed that the hull's iron rivets failed to brittle fracture, which is the sudden and rapid snapping. This means that there was a failure in the structural materials, and this usually happens as a result of low temperature, high impact loading, and high sulfur content, all 3 of which were present on the night of the tragedy. The water temperature was below freezing, the Titanic was traveling at a high speed upon impact with the iceberg, and the hull steel contained high levels of sulfur. These chunks of metal gave researchers one of the main answers as to why the Titanic sunk that night. In our number 7 spot today, we have rich remains. When we think of the story of the Titanic, we of course think of the sinking of the ship. We talk about how the survivors were saved, and then of course we think of the catastrophic loss of life. Many people don't stop to ask what happened with all of those who passed away in the tragedy, however. More than 1,500 people passed away in the sinking of the Titanic, and only 337 bodies were pulled from the water. A scholar named Jess Beer has recently examined what was done with those bodies, and throughout this research they have come to realize that whether or not these people got identified and what happened to the remains in the end all depended on their class and economic standing in life. About 1/3 of the recovered bodies ended up being returned to the sea because rescuers didn't think that they would get any sort of life insurance payout from the families of those who had passed and who were of a lower economic standing. For any bodies to be preserved for land burial, the remains had to be easily identifiable, and they needed to have a quote economic value even after death, with a high social or economic worth. In our number 6 spot today, we have the unidentified passenger. Until about 10 years ago, there were human remains that were recovered from the Titanic sinking that were unidentified despite researchers' best efforts. Initially, there was one identity that they thought they could link the body to, but there were also 5 other identities on the table, and no one was sure how to confirm who this person really was. A little over a decade ago, however, using mitochondrial DNA testing, the re-examining of the DNA gave a 98.87% certainty the unknown person was in fact a passenger named Sidney Goodwin. A man named Ryan Parr is heavily credited with helping bring this mystery to a close, although he insists it couldn't have been done without the help of numerous researchers and scientists who also worked to reveal this passenger's true identity.
Number 6. They were told about the iceberg. Yep, you heard that right, folks. By 7:30 p.m., the Titanic had received 5 warnings by nearby ships. Marconi wireless operator Jack Phillips took down a detailed ship's message pinpointing the location of heavy packs of ice and a great number of bergs, but Phillips, busy sending passengers personal messages, apparently did not show it to any officer. At 10:55 p.m., another ship, the Californian, radioed to say it had come to a full stop amid dense field ice. Now, neither of those messages began with the crucial code that would have required Phillips to show it to Captain Smith, and Phillips was not in the mood for interruptions. Now, the Californian's electric signal was so close it nearly deafened Phillips. Shut up, he radioed back. I am busy. Now, a while later, the Californian's radio operator shut down for the night. As the Titanic surged onward, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee peered into the darkness. Just before 11:40, Fleet noticed something blacker than the sea lying directly ahead. As the ship drew closer, recognition dawned. He rang a warning bell 3 times and phoned the bridge. "What did you see?" came a voice through the receiver. "Iceberg right ahead," replied Fleet. Now, it's crazy that they had all these warnings and still nothing was done about it. Number 5. The Titanic wasn't the Titanic. Okay, so this is a conspiracy theory, but I feel like it has to be mentioned. One of the controversial and elaborate theories surrounding the sinking of the Titanic was made by Robin Gardner in his book Titanic, The Ship That Never Sank, 1998. Gardner draws on several events and coincidences that occurred in the months, days, and hours leading up to the sinking of the Titanic, and concludes that the ship that sank was in fact Titanic's sister ship, Olympic, disguised as Titanic as an insurance scam by its owners. The International Mercantile Marine Group, controlled by American financier J.P. Morgan, had acquired the White Star Line in 1902. Would they have really put all those people's lives at risk on purpose? I don't know, but it's definitely something worth thinking about. Number 4, no binoculars. Now, one of the most useful pieces of equipment, the binoculars, were nowhere in sight, no pun intended, when the Titanic left on its voyage. Binoculars that could have been used by lookouts on the night of the collision were locked up aboard the ship, and the key was held by David Blair, an officer who was bumped from the crew before the ship's departure from Southampton. Some historians have speculated that the fatal iceberg may have been spotted earlier if the binoculars were in use, but others say it wouldn't have made a difference. Regardless, binoculars would have been a good thing to have on board, and it seems like they sabotaged themselves by not having any. Also, my question is, why were they locked up away somewhere that you needed a key to get it out? It just doesn't make any sense. Number 3, the fire. In Titanic, The New Evidence, Irish journalist Shannon Manoli argues at the hull of the infamous ship weeks before it set sail. Through researching photos and eyewitness testimony from the time, Maloney contends that a fire spontaneously lit inside one of the Titanic's enormous coral bunkers critically weakened a crucial segment of the ship's hull. In a discovery of a trove of photographs documenting the ship's construction and preparations for its maiden voyage. Now, as he pored over the images, Maloney was shocked to see a 30-foot long black streak documented on the outside of the Titanic's hull, close to where the iceberg struck its starboard side. According to engineers from the Imperial College London, the streak in the photograph may have been caused by a fire in one of the Titanic's coal bunkers, a 3-story tall room that stored much of the coal that fueled the ship's engines. Maloney believes that the fire had started as early as 3 weeks before the Titanic set out for its maiden voyage, but was ignored for fear of bad press and the desire to keep the ship on schedule. Then the fire caused damage, which made them hitting the iceberg a fatal mistake. Number 2, last-minute cancellations. As the Titanic was prepared to sail, some 50 booked passengers had such strong forebodings that they refused to board at the last minute, willing to lose the high cost of passage. Yep, all of a sudden they just went, nah. Now, absent was financier J.P. Morgan, whose International Mercantile Marine Shipping Trust controlled the White Star Line, and who had selected Ismay as a company officer. Morgan had planned to join his associates on the Titanic, but canceled at the last minute when some business matters delayed him, or did he know that the ship was going to sink? Now, other prominent passengers that decided not to board were former United States Secretary of State Robert Bacon, Alfred Gwen Wilderbitz, and candy tycoon Milton Snavely Hershey and his wife Catherine. Now, did they have some sort of insider information? I don't know, but it's strange. And coming in at number 1 is the wreck of the Titan. In 1898, author Morgan Robertson wrote The Wreck of the Titan. It seemed to very accurately predict what was going to happen to the Titanic. Robertson had written about a ship, the Titan, going on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic that struck an iceberg and sank. The liner did not have enough lifeboats, and it was described as being unsinkable, seeing as it was one of the biggest ships of its day. Now, doesn't that sound all too familiar? And the story was written 14 years before the sinking of the Titanic. Many wondered if Robson was a prescient writer, but others said he just knew what he was talking about since he wrote mainly about maritime affairs. Now, perhaps he saw ocean liners becoming bigger and bigger and wondered about the dangers of this, including icebergs. He was approached and asked if he was clairvoyant after the sinking of the Titanic. No, he replied, "I know what I'm writing about, that's all, but I'm not too sure about that."